In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front lower control arm on this GMC Yukon. After finishing this repair, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle. Let's get started. Take a 22mm socket and remove all 6 of your lug nuts. With those off, remove the wheel. I want to unplug and remove the ABS wire from this upper control arm. And the reason I want to unplug it is so that I have enough slack in the wire when I pull the knuckle down. You can see the connector located right here next to your brake line. The red tab here is a locking tab that you'll have to push backwards. Sometimes you'll need a pocket screwdriver to help you out. There we go. Now, with that unlocked, you should be able to press on the locking tab for it and pull it off. So if you slide that forward, you'll be able to see it better, and then you can disconnect it. Leave this over there. On the control arm, it has a bracket that secures onto the brake hose here. I'm going to try and pry this retainer off, set this aside this way, and let's take the 10mm bolt off of that brake hose bracket. Pull this off. Next, let's take the tie rod off of the knuckle. Use a 21mm socket, remove the mounting nut. Okay, you can see for me, the tie rod popped out of the knuckle, which is great, but that's also causing it to spin the stud, not just the nut. I'm going to push it down, see if that helps. Looks like it does not. If this happens to you, the only way to fix it is to put a wrench on the nut and a 10mm socket on the stud. Turn them against each other, and that should unthread the mounting nut from the stud. Okay, get this off of here. And of course, if yours was still stuck in the knuckle, you would have been able to take the mounting nut off directly. But also at this point, you'd have to unseize it. You can tap the stud upwards this way. Just be careful not to hit the threads. You do have quite a bit of space here before you do hit the threads to make sure you don't mushroom it. Or you could use a special stud remover, tie rod end remover, which is kind of like a fork that pinches down on this and pushes this up. You want to avoid hammering on the knuckle with a steel hammer because it's an aluminum knuckle. Pull this off, use a 36mm socket and remove the axle nut. If you don't have a powerful air gun like this, you can break it free with a pry bar between the lug studs and holding the pry bar, breaking the axle nut free. There's also a washer behind here that we have to remove. At this point, you want to make sure that the axle pushes through. You can see this one does. If this doesn't happen to you, you want to put a center punch here and just tap it with a hammer. Make sure you don't smash the threads, or you could also put the axle nut flush back on and then use a hammer directly on that. But I'm good to go here. It can easily move in and out. From behind the knuckle now, since you can freely turn it, you'll see this 18mm mounting nut that is for the upper ball joint. So the only way you can get to this at this point is with a wrench. Put a wrench on it. It shouldn't be crazy tight. Just break it free, and you're going to want to remove it pretty much all the way at this point. Brake hose is going to be somewhat in your way. Just be careful not to damage it. If the studs start spinning on you, there is a cutout for an Allen socket in there. Hopefully we don't have to use that though. I also sprayed everything with rust penetrant so that it helps the threads slide a little bit easier. If your threads are extra rusty, consider wire brushing them. That usually helps, especially when you're using hand tools like this. Okay, the mounting nut is off. I will leave it on just a few threads. Now I will use a rubber mallet, not a steel hammer, and tap the knuckle, paying attention to my brake hose, not to smash this completely, but I want to tap the knuckle, which will hopefully break this free. And the reason I'm leaving the nut on here is so that when it does break free, the control arm doesn't come flying out and the knuckle flying forward. All right, here we go. Rubber mallet, not steel hammer. Hopefully this breaks free. And you want to pay attention to this brake hose that you don't actually smash it while you're doing this. There we go, that popped off. Now using a pry bar that goes in between the control arm and the spring, pull the control arm down, remove this mounting nut, and slowly lift the control arm up. There we go. Now with the knuckle coming forward, make sure that ball joint comes out and make sure the axle pushes through. There we go. We can leave this here at this point. Make sure the ABS wire is safely out of your way. Now let's take the caliper off. I'm going to take it off as an assembly with the bracket. 2 18mm bolts is what holds this on. With the top one removed, I'm actually going to start it on just a few threads so that it holds the caliper while I remove the lower one. I have a bungee cord ready so I can attach the caliper once it's off the knuckle. With that second bolt removed, pull the caliper off, and I'm going to hook it onto my bungee cord here. The reason for this is I don't want to let the caliper hang on the brake hose. That can actually stretch it and damage it. Then you'll have to replace it. Make sure it's secure so that it's not going to fall off of here. If this is twisted a little bit, that's all right, as long as it's not pulling pressure. The rotor is held on with a T30 Torx bolt. Hopefully yours has had NECs put on it. A lot of times these do Cs hold the rotor. Pull this off and set it aside. And now you can remove the rotor, set that aside safely. Now use a 24mm socket and remove the lower ball joint mounting nut. Be careful because this is the last thing holding this knuckle on, so if it breaks free, it's going to want to come down. Okay, looks like it did break free, which actually works out for us. You just are going to have to be careful about this. Now you're going to have to find just the right angle for the axle and the ball joint stud to come out at the same time. The axle, you're going to have to pry backwards. Pull it out of the hub while pulling the knuckle down. Okay, there we go. There we go. Now it's time to remove the sway bar link. You have a 15mm mounting nut on the top and the stud, which is actually the link itself, underneath the control arm. It'll have a 15mm head. I cleaned up the threads on the top side here, and I also soaked it down in a lot of rust penetrant. It's looking pretty promising. A lot of times these actually either snap or you'll need some heat and a lot of leverage to take these out. What I'm going to start with is a long wrench just to try to break this free. It may spin the whole thing, or maybe this is not going to spin and the nut will just break free. Take it easy at first. Okay. Work it back and forth to get that rust penetrant into the threads. It's spinning somewhat easily, still requires quite a bit of force, but I think I can switch to a ratcheting wrench now. See how far I make it with this before it gets stuck. Definitely getting a little stiffer now, so I'm going to switch back to my longer wrench. All right, looks like I saved it. A lot of times this is the most difficult part of the job here. Now with this mounting nut off, I'm going to try and pry this bushing out of here. There we go. Take this off. If you're going to reuse these, set it aside safely. I'm going to put the nut back on just a few threads now, and what I want to do is try to use a hammer and tap it down, and that'll hopefully drive it down through the rest of itself. Basically, it has this outer sleeve here that it needs to break free from. I'm going to put a 15mm socket underneath, hold this plastic sleeve with pliers. Okay, if you get it to spin like that a little bit, that should allow it to break free. So we can now grab a hammer, tap this down. There we go. Take this off of here now. Use a pry bar or a chisel to drive this down the rest of the way. And there it is. Now we can remove this right here. The other side is obviously still on, so that's why the sway bar won't move, but there's our sway bar link. This is not in great condition, but if you had to, it is reusable. Now we have to remove the 2 strut bolts that hold the strut onto the control arm here. Those are both going to be 15 millimeter in size. Take both of them out. Inspect them, because a lot of times these rust, and if they need to be replaced, well, you're going to have to replace them so that the strut can be properly secured to the control arm. These are in good condition. Just going to clean up the threads a little bit and then reuse them. The lower control arm is held on with 2 bolts now that go through the frame and through the control arm bushings. This is the forward bolt. The head's an 18 millimeter in size. On the other side, it'll have a 24 millimeter mounting nut. So hold the bolt with an 18 wrench and put a 24 socket on the mounting nut. Pull that off. There's also a washer that will sit here. Save this. This bolt should be free. You can pull it out this way. All right. Mine is in great condition. If yours is not, consider replacing it. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Hold the bolt with an 18 millimeter, except on this side, if you use an air gun, you're going to need a swivel to clear the axle. As soon as you break this free, keep in mind the control arm will want to swing down. Once you get to this point, you'll realize that there is no way that this bolt can clear the sway bar and basically come out, so you can take the control arm out. So you can leave this as is, and we're going to have to unbolt the 2 bolts holding the sway bar bracket on this side. You may or may not have to disconnect the other side as well. I'm going to start with just this side and see how much swing that gives me. Now, keep in mind with the other side sway bar link still connected, you still have some support on the sway bar, but not a lot. Consider spraying the top of the threads with rust penetrant. I know mine will come off because they've been recently removed, but regardless, 10 millimeter socket, that's the size of both of these bolts. Hold it. There we go. We may not have to take the other side off because it looks like we have just enough wiggle room on this one to slide the bolt out. Pull that bolt out. I'm going to leave it right here so that it's ready for when I reinstall the control arm. And there's your control arm. Take your new control arm, slide it in here. I have a rubber mallet ready because it will most likely need to be persuaded to fit. As soon as this rear bolt lines up, I'm going to put this bolt through. Keep in mind the rear bolt has a longer shank to it because the bushing is wider. Start it in. I put anti-seize on the shank of the bolt. That way it stays nice and lubricated and does not rust over time. Since this is lined up, I'm going to put the front bolt in. All right, let's get the sway bar reattached. This is a good time to lubricate the bushing. Mine already has plenty of silicone paste on it. The torque for these is 37 foot-pounds. Now let's put the mounting nuts on. When you put the washer on, you'll see that it has a convex shape to it. You want to make sure that it's pointing towards the tip of the bolt, towards the end of it, or towards the nut, I should say. And same for the nut. The tapered edge will be towards the outside, the flat edge towards the inside. Start this on, and then we're going to bottom this out, but don't tighten it up. I want to make sure the control arm still moves around until we get the other one situated so we can bring this up to ride height and torque it at ride height. We don't want to put these bushings in a bind by clamping them together like this, and then, well, you can't twist them to bring them up to ride height. So 18 millimeter wrench on the bolt side, 24 on the nut side. Snug these up, but once again, make sure the control arm can still move. Okay, it's pretty much bottomed out, but this still moves easily, so let's do the other bolt. Now bring the control arm up and line it up with the strut. You may need a helper so that the bolts can get started while you line everything up. That way they don't cross thread. Okay, one is started. At this point you can safely let go and start the other one. Now use the 15mm socket that you used to remove them and snug them up. The torque for these two is 37 foot-pounds. And 2. Now before we move further, we need to torque the control arm to frame bolts. And to do that properly, we want to raise this control arm up to ride height. If you're on the ground, you can use a floor jack. I'm on a lift, so I'm going to use a pole jack. Regardless, you're going to want to lift the control arm up to approximately ride height. Now with it at ride height, let's torque these mounting nuts to 129 foot-pounds. Hold the bolt side if needed. All right, there we go. They're both torqued. Release pressure off of your support. Now it's time to get the sway bar link back in. I like to start by putting this piece on, and if you can't fit the bushings, you're probably going to need a pry bar to pry the sway bar up. All prying up on this very carefully, of course. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the center is now in. The bolt still has that bottom washer on. I'm going to slide this through. I put anti-seize all over it, so it should be good to go. As you slide it in here, make sure that the bottom actually makes it all the way through. There we go. That's what it's supposed to look like. You should have enough space for the bushing and the washer, of course, or the nut with the washer. And now when you tighten this, hold the top with your 15mm on the bottom side, also 15mm, and just tighten it until you start seeing the bushing squish. Just like that. If you tighten it any more than this, it will most likely squeeze the bushings to a pancake pretty much, and then it will basically wear them out prematurely. You can also check it up here. If it feels nice and snug, you should be good to go. If needed, clean up the splines of the axle. Mine look pretty good. And take off any old grease or anti-seize that might be on the splines. And I'm just going to apply new grease, in this case anti-seize, a little bit over here and mainly on the splines here. This is going to prevent the axle from actually seizing in the hub in the future. You don't need a lot, just a thin layer, enough to coat it. Now it's time to get the knuckle on here. I'm going to put it over the axle first, and then I'm going to pull the lower ball joint out completely. Kind of try to do both at once here. Pull the axle down, put it over the ball joint, wiggle it back and forth, hopefully line everything up, push the ball joint in and up. Now it's on. I have the ball joint nut ready to go so that I can pull this up just a little bit, thread on that mounting nut to basically prevent the knuckle from falling off. There we go. It's on temporarily, obviously. We're going to have to pull it up so that we can actually tighten that lower ball joint nut. To finish putting the axle through, give it a spin and wiggle it up and down. That should allow it to slide into the splines of the hub here. There we go, just like that. Now let's tighten up this mounting nut. The torque for this is really high, so I'm not concerned about over tightening it with the air gun. I'm going to hold the knuckle up and tighten it on. Now that it's fully bottomed out, I'm going to back it off just a little bit. And that is because the torque starts at 37 foot-pounds, and then we're going to do an additional 125 to 135 degrees. I'm just going to aim for 130 right in the middle, but it's a two-step procedure, 37 foot-pounds and then 120 degrees. Let's start with 37 foot-pounds. All right, it's important that your baseline torque is accurate so that the 120 degrees ends up in a proper torque application. So there you have it, 120 degrees. If you don't have a torque wrench that reads degrees or a degree meter, 120 degrees is just under a third of a full turn. So basically between a quarter and a half. Now it's time to put the rotor back on. My hub looks really good, so there's nothing for me to clean up other than wiping off old anti-seize and reapplying new anti-seize. It's important to do this because especially if you live in rusty climates. Well, the rotor will seize onto the hub. It's not going to be a fun time removing it if it gets stuck. So I like to coat this with anti-seize, not too much, and try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. So try to focus on the hub surface, especially these two lips here. This is recessed in, so it doesn't matter as much, but here and here is what matters. If the backside of your rotor is rusty, where it goes onto the hub, clean it up, sand it down, make sure it's nice and flat. Mine is not, mine's in great shape, so I'm gonna put it right back on here. And I'm gonna use the T30 Torx screw to lock this on. The threads of this bolt already have anti-seize on them. If it didn't, I would put some on. Just make that snug. Don't crank it down too hard. It's just there to hold the rotor in place until you put the wheel on. Now take the caliper, slide it over the rotor, line it up with the knuckle, and I have my bolts ready to thread in. Move it around as needed to line them up. As soon as they want to start, go ahead and thread them in by hand. They should thread on smoothly. Once you have the top one on, you can let go and use your other hand to move this around to line up the bottom. Let's snug these up. 18mm socket on these. The torque for these two is 170 foot-pounds. Now let's get the knuckle up here. To do that, I'm going to use a pry bar on the upper control arm to pry it down. I'm going to get this ready. Have the mounting nut ready, the one that goes on the upper ball joint. Make sure you don't pinch the ABS wire. Grab the knuckle, line up the knuckle with the ball joint stud. Use the pry bar to pry this down. Just like that. And with it held down like that, start the ball joint nut on, and as soon as it does, just bring it up as many threads as you can. Now you can let go, and the control arm is temporarily safely secured. Continue to pry down on the ball joint nut and use your 18mm wrench to tighten this up. If the stud starts spinning on you, you can just put extra pressure with the pry bar. Whoop, spinning the knuckle. All right. As soon as it starts spinning the knuckle like this, we can just go to the other side, which we could have done from the beginning, but for me it was easier to start it with my right hand. As you tighten this, keep in mind that the torque for it is 37 foot-pounds and 100 degrees. So because we're unable to fit a torque wrench in here, I don't have anything that'll fit. I'm just going to make it as tight as I can by hand. What you also can do, since this is a locking nut, you can put a little bit of grease on the top of the threads there. That'll remove some of the friction, as well as on the flange of the nut. That'll also remove some of the friction, and you can more easily tighten it by hand. All right, that should be nice and tight. Let's get the axle nut back on. I'm gonna put the washer on first, and then the mounting nut itself. And I'm going to start it on with the air gun, but as you'll notice, I'm going to stop right as it bottoms out because I don't want to tighten it with a power tool. I want to torque it by hand so that I don't over tighten that bearing and cause it to fail prematurely. Now I'm going to stick a long pry bar through the studs here. Make sure it's not at an angle so you don't damage the threads. And then I can use my torque wrench to torque it. The torque for this axle nut is 188 foot-pounds. I have my pry bar through the studs, 188 foot-pounds. There it is right there. Perfect. If you have a lot of greasy fingerprints on your rotors, go ahead and wipe these off with a clean rag and some brake parts cleaner. You don't want any grease on this surface. There we go. That was quite dirty. Now a lot of this stuff that's smearing is brake dust from the inside part here, so that's fine. I'm just trying to get the grease off. Now take your tie rod end, put it through the knuckle, put the mounting nut on, snug it up, 21mm socket. If this happens, just press down on the tie rod end. That should lock that stud in. There we go. Now once it's bottomed out, the torque for it is 26 foot-pounds, so it's really not that high. I'm probably already there. Yep, there we go. Let's get the brake hose bracket resecured. Put that 10mm headed bolt back in. and snug it up. Once you get it nice and snug, resecure the ABS wire right into this bracket. Make sure the retainer actually locks in. If there's any sand in these connectors, go ahead and get it out of there. Click these two back together, lock that red tab, and then if you took it off of this retainer, slide it right back. That's locked in. Let's get the wheels back on. Put on all 6 of your lug nuts, and then in a cross pattern, torque them to 140 foot-pounds. 140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Here we go. And it's always a good idea to double check them. This time you don't have to go in a cross pattern though. All right, now take it for a road test and of course, get an alignment.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.